The watch industry has a problem it does not talk about. It has spent a century training people to believe that price and quality move together, that a more expensive watch is a better watch, and that the difference lives in the object rather than in the marketing budget behind it. Most of the time, that is not true, and there are a small number of watches, sold for the price of a dinner, that make it embarrassingly obvious. These 10 are the ones most people walk straight past. Number 10. Casio MQ24. 15. Stop for a second and actually look at this thing. It is analog. It is thin. The case is minimalist in the way that looks like a designer spent 4 years arriving at it. The dial is clean, the hands are simple, and nothing on it fights for your attention. It costs about $15. The MQ24 is Casio's almost invisible analog line. It never appears in best budget watch roundups because it is not dramatic enough to generate a click. No world time, no module, no digital display, no backlight, no story. What it has is years of battery life on a single cell, a Japanese quartz movement, and proportions that make it look quietly expensive in a way Casio's famous digital models never even attempt. Here is the observation that puts it on this list. The people who design genuinely expensive watches spend an enormous amount of energy on restraint, on knowing what to leave out, on resisting the urge to add a complication, a date window, a texture to the dial, a second color to the hands. The ones who get it right end up with something that looks inevitable. Like there was never any other option. The MQ24 arrives at exactly that place. Possibly by accident, possibly by budget constraint, possibly because at $15 there was simply nothing left to add. The result is the same. It looks like a decision was made, and a clean one. Picture the person who wears this into a meeting. Nobody assumes it cost $15. Nobody looks twice. It reads as intentional in a way that is almost embarrassing for every watch costing 10 times more that achieved half the restraint. There is a specific satisfaction in wearing a watch nobody can price by looking at it. You know what it cost. Nobody else does. That gap is a kind of quiet power that $5,000 watches pay a marketing department to manufacture and don't always get. The MQ24 has it for free. And if a $15 watch looking that composed bothers you, the next one is going to bother you more because it comes on a steel bracelet. Number 9. Casio A158WA. 20. Here is something that should not exist at its price point. A stainless steel bracelet, a chrome-plated case, an LED backlight, a stopwatch, all on a watch you can buy for less than lunch. The A158 sits on the shelf right next to Casio's famous plastic digital, and almost everybody grabs the plastic one. That is a mistake. The steel bracelet looks like something Casio charges significantly more for on their higher-end vintage-style line. The proportions are tight, around 33 millimeters across. And that is the point. It does not try to look expensive. It looks right. There is a thickness to the bracelet links that does not feel cheap in the hand. Pick one up. It has a weight-to-price ratio that should not be physically possible in a $20 object. Casio launched this design in the late 80s and has barely needed to touch it since, which tells you something about how well it was resolved the first time. And the reason collectors have a soft spot for it is specific. During the pandemic, a certain kind of buyer started picking up small steel digital watches, bored, a little nostalgic, and suddenly cost-conscious. Word moved through collector forums that this was the best-looking piece of value engineering Casio had produced in decades, and it sold out repeatedly. Not because of a trend piece, not because an influencer wore one, because people who own Submariners and Speedmasters looked at a $20 watch and concluded it was doing something none of their other watches were doing. The collector term for a watch like this is honest. It does not pretend to be anything it is not. It has a steel bracelet because it can, and it costs $20 because the people who made it decided that is what it should cost. The gap between those two facts is where the value lives. Most watches are priced for aspiration. This one is priced for what it is. The next watch is 4 times the money and goes 200 meters underwater. Number 8. Casio Duro MDV106. $55. If you ask an experienced collector to name the best value in watches under $100, a startling number of them say this one without hesitating. It is a dive watch. 200 meters of water resistance. Not the 50-meter splash rating most watches at this price hide behind, but a genuine 200. The same figure you find on dive watches costing 20 times more. A unidirectional rotating bezel. A screw-down crown. A case that looks, from any reasonable distance, like something costing several $100s. $55. The reason this watch has the reputation it does is not the specs on paper. It is the gap between the specs and the price, and the fact that nobody has closed that gap in over a decade of trying. Every year, a new microbrand launches a dive watch at $200 and gets compared to this. Every year the comparison is uncomfortable, because the honest answer is that the expensive one gives you a better bracelet, a sapphire crystal, and a name. And everything that actually keeps water out of the case is doing the same job on both. The place it shows up most is on the wrists of people who own considerably better watches. It is the one that goes on for yard work, for the beach, for anywhere the good watch is not going. And a remarkable number of those people report the same thing. They reach for it more than they expected to. That is not a compliment about the price. That is a compliment about the watch. The next one is made by a company you have definitely heard of, hiding behind a name you probably have not. Number 7. Lorus. 60. Here is a fact that reorganizes the budget watch aisle the moment you learn it. Lorus is owned by Seiko, not inspired by, not similar to. It is a brand belonging to the Seiko Watch Corporation, sitting inside the same company, drawing on the same manufacturing knowledge, and sold at a fraction of the price, usually somewhere around $60. Most people who walk past a Lorus in a department store assume it is a generic mall brand. That assumption is the entire reason the value exists. Nobody is bidding the price up because nobody knows what they are looking at. What you get is quartz accuracy, a case finished better than the price suggests, and design language that will feel oddly familiar if you have spent any time looking at Seiko, because it comes from the same place. There is a broader pattern here worth understanding, and it goes far beyond watches. Large manufacturers routinely run multiple brands at different price points on shared engineering. The expensive badge pays for the marketing. The cheap badge quietly sells the same competence to people who never find out. The watch industry does this constantly and does not enjoy discussing it. Lorus is the clearest example available at this price, sitting in plain sight, in a glass case, being ignored by everyone who walked in specifically looking for a good cheap watch. The next watch turned more people into collectors than any other object in this hobby. Number 6. Seiko 5 SNK809. 110. Pull the collection histories of serious collectors, the ones with grand Seikos in rotation, with vintage pieces they do not mention casually, and ask what they started with. A disproportionate number will name this. It is a 37mm field watch on a canvas strap. The movement is Seiko's own automatic. 21 jewels, no hacking, no manual wind. The accuracy is loose by any objective standard. The power reserve is around 40 hours. None of that is why it is here. The SNK is the watch that taught an entire generation what an automatic movement actually feels like. Not as a concept you have read about. The physical thing. The rotor spins when your arm swings, and you can feel it through the case back if you press your thumb against the glass. The second hand does not tick once per second like a quartz watch. It sweeps continuously because the movement runs at 21,000 vibrations an hour, and the hand follows that rhythm without pausing. Nobody who puts a real automatic on their wrist for the first time and feels that sweep forgets it. For a very large number of people, this Seiko is where it happened. The canvas strap comes stiff from the factory and breaks in over about 3 weeks of daily wear, softening until it sits against the wrist as though it was cut for that wrist specifically. Nothing on the dial fights for your attention. The whole watch is a single clear idea, and it does not apologize for what it cost. There are collectors who own several vintage Rolexes and still wear this on weekends. Not as a beater, not ironically, because it is the watch that made them understand what they were looking at. One practical note: Seiko has wound this line down, so prices have drifted up and availability varies. That is what happens when enough people work out what something is. The next watch solved a problem this one never even attempted, and it did it in the 1970s. Number 5. Citizen BM8180 Garrison. 110. Picture someone who has worn the same beaten-up digital watch for 3 years, finally decides to buy something analog and respectable, sets a hard budget of $100, and walks into a watch store. They do not leave with this. They leave with a basic quartz from whichever brand the salesperson mentioned, because the Citizen Solar watches are on the opposite wall, and nobody is pointing at them. There is no margin story to tell about them. That is the Garrison's entire problem. Nobody makes the case for it. So here is the case. It runs on Citizen's Eco Drive, a solar movement that charges from any light source, natural or artificial, and holds enough charge to run for around 6 months in complete darkness. There is no battery to replace. Ever. 100 meters of water resistance. A 37mm case, which sounds small until you notice that most people with normal wrists are buying 42mm watches because that is what the industry pushes, not because that is what fits. An olive nylon strap that looks like something off a field watch costing 5 times more. EcoDrive launched in the mid-70s. Citizen has been refining it for roughly 50 years, and the movement uses a thin-film solar cell, the same underlying physics as a commercial solar panel, compressed into a watch dial. This is not a gimmick. It is mature technology from a company that has been perfecting it since before most watch influencers were born. Now think about what solar actually solves. A standard quartz battery lasts 2 or 3 years. You forget to replace it, the watch stops, and it either goes somewhere for service, or it sits in a drawer. The friction of maintenance is what kills most watches' daily use. Remove the friction, and the watch becomes permanent, in a way nothing else at this price manages. The people who own one describe it the same way. They stopped thinking about it. It is there when they need it, accurate when they check it, and the last time they thought about it as an object was the day they bought it. The next watch costs more and does less, and it is worth every dollar of the difference. Number 4. Orient Bambino. 150. The dress watch is the hardest category in affordable watchmaking because there is nothing to hide behind. No bezel, no complications, no tool watch excuse. Just a case, a dial, and 2 hands, with every proportion visible to anyone who looks. Most brands at this price avoid the category entirely. The ones that try produce something that reads as a costume. The Bambino does not. Domed crystal, domed dial, a case with genuine curvature to it, and a movement Orient designed and built themselves. Automatic, in-house, at $150. Read that again, because the industry would prefer you did not think about it too hard. In-house movement manufacturing is one of the most heavily marketed phrases in this business. Brands charge thousands for it and put it in the first line of the press release. Orient does it and charges $150 and says almost nothing about it. The reason is structural. Orient is owned by Seiko Epson, and they have been building their own calibers for decades in their own facility. They have the industrial capacity to do at this price what other brands can only do at 4 figures. And no marketing department invested in convincing you it is special. What you notice on the wrist is the crystal. The dome catches light at angles a flat sapphire never does, which is the specific optical trick that makes vintage watches look the way they do. That effect is why people pay real money for old dress watches, and it is sitting here for $150. The next watch is nearly the same money and carries over a century and a half of history behind it. Number 3. Timex Marlin Automatic. 170. The original Marlin appeared in the mid-60s. It was a dress watch for people who needed to look like they cared without spending money they did not have. Office workers, teachers, young men in their first suit. The kind of people who bought a watch once and expected to hand it to somebody. Timex brought it back in 2017, first as a faithful hand-wind reissue, and then as an automatic. It is the automatic that earns its place here, and what it brought back is uncomfortably good-looking for the money. The dial is restrained without being boring. Arabic numerals, clean hands, nothing competing for attention. The steel case is curved to sit against a wrist properly, rather than sitting flat on the skin like a disc, which is more engineering consideration than plenty of automatics at 3 times the price bother with. Inside sits a Miyota automatic, and this is where the argument gets pointed. Miyota calibers are made by Citizen's Movement Division in Japan, and they power watches sold by brands at prices well into 4 figures. The same movement family. The names on the dials are different. The thing doing the work underneath is not. The Marlin gets it for $170. And there is a piece of context most reviews skip. Timex has been making watches since the 1850s. They survived the quartz crisis by building inexpensive quartz watches while Swiss brands were shutting down or being absorbed. They survived the digital era and the smartwatch boom by not trying to compete with either. They just kept making watches for people who wanted a watch. That institutional knowledge is not marketing copy. It is well over a century of knowing what a watch needs to do and doing it without charging you for the story. Pick one up and it feels right in the hand in a way that is hard to put into words. Not impressive. Not trying to impress. Just right. The next watch is cheaper and beats it on almost every specification that can be measured. Number 2. Orient Mako 2. Shiu Sasur Trao. Kamasu. 160. Orient appears twice on this list, and it is not an accident. They occupy a position almost nobody else does. The Mako is 41.5 millimeters, 200 meters of water resistance, a unidirectional rotating bezel, a signed crown, and a date window with a rim around it. A small detail most watches at this price forget entirely, and one you notice the absence of forever once somebody points it out. But the part that matters is inside. The caliber in this watch is Orient's own, not a Miyota, not an ETA, not a clone of either. Their own design, built in their own facility, with hacking and manual winding on top of automatic. Features most competitors leave out at this price to protect margin. The rated accuracy is loose on paper, and most units in practice land far tighter, competitive with Swiss automatics costing 3 or 4 times more, without any regulation work. So here is the uncomfortable observation. Orient is an in-house movement manufacturer that prices its watches below what many competitors charge for, movements those competitors did not design themselves. The watch industry has an agreed upon story about what things should cost and why, and which names justify which prices. The Mako does not follow that story. It builds its own movement, regulates it to a tighter standard than competitors at higher prices, charges less for the finished product, and lets the watch make the argument. The pattern among owners is consistent enough to be funny. People buy one as a placeholder, something to wear while saving for something serious. Years later, they own the serious watch and still reach for the Orient on Saturdays. Not because the expensive one is too nice to wear, because this one is too good to retire. And the number 1 watch on this list is cheaper than every automatic we have covered. And the engineering inside it is unlike anything else at this price or any other. Number 1. Vostok Amphibia. $90. In the late 1960s, the Soviet Ministry of Defense needed a dive watch for naval frogmen. They went to the Chistopol watch factory, the same factory that had been evacuated from Moscow by horse cart in 1941, when German forces were 3 weeks from the city. Thousands of carts carried equipment across a frozen river to keep it alive. That is what this watch descends from. The engineers at Chistopol had a problem. They could not replicate the case construction Swiss dive watches used. The tolerances required for a conventional screw-down crown with proper depth sealing were beyond what their machinery could consistently achieve at volume. So they did something else. They engineered a case where external water pressure actively helps seal the watch instead of threatening to breach it. The crystal is slightly flexible acrylic. The case back is a bayonet fitting. The deeper you go, the harder the water pushes the seals inward. tightening the watch around itself. 200 meters of water resistance, achieved not by copying Swiss engineering, but by solving the problem from a completely different direction. Swiss watchmakers at the time called the approach crude. In one sense, they were not wrong. The finishing is not fine. The movement can vary between units. The bracelet on some versions is the weakest part of the package, but the watch has been in continuous production for close to 60 years. The pressure-sealed case still works at depth, and you can buy a new one today for around $90. When the Soviet Union collapsed and state contracts evaporated overnight, the factory adapted to private ownership and kept making Amphibious. Because what else do you do when your main product has been validated by decades of naval divers? There are maybe 24 genuinely original engineering ideas in affordable watchmaking. Most cheap watches are simplified versions of expensive ones. The Amphibia is not a simplified anything. It is an original solution to a real problem, arrived at by people who could not afford to copy the answer everyone else was using. That is why it is number one. Not the price, and not the history, though both are remarkable, because everything else on this list is a good watch made cheaply. This is a good idea that happens to be cheap, and nobody else has ever had it.